Welcome to Science on Tap, Minocqua. Thanks for coming. My name is Susan Knight. I work at UW Trout Lake Station. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And we started Science on Tap not so that you would have a lecture, but so that you could hear some comments about some interesting topic and then ask your own questions. So we hope you'll do that today. And I'd like to remind you about all of our partners in Science on Tap. We have UW Trout Lake Station, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, the Minocqua Public Library, and our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to all of them. And Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Foundation on the campus of UW-Madison. So thanks to them. And just a reminder that there are 4 ways to watch. Of course, you can watch right here, as you all are tonight. And there's also live streaming for anyone who is someplace else when this is going on, so that you can watch from your own computer if you've got enough bandwidth. There's also live streaming at Minocqua Public Library, where you can sit and watch with Mary Taylor and drink root beer and eat pretzels. And then you can also watch any event later. So we archive all of our programs. And not only do we archive the entire program, but we have these little shorts that are between 7 to 10 minutes. So you can get just a little bit of the introductory comments and a couple of questions. And nice to get a little flavor of what the program was about. So our next Science on Tap will be December 6th. And our topic will be robotics and artificial intelligence with UW computer science professor Bilge Mootlu. Not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. So anyway, tonight we have Birds in the Northwoods with Alan Haney. He is retired professor and dean from UW Stevens Point. Alan grew up in southern Ohio on property homesteaded by his great-great-great-grandfather. Did I get the numbers right? So early on, he developed a love of nature and of the out of doors, and by the age of 10, he knew that he wanted to be a forester. His parents were teachers, and from all the dinner table conversation, I'm sure there's some people here who can relate to this, said he was never going to be a teacher. But as it turned out, when he became a graduate student, he discovered he loved teaching, and he went on to a 37-year career in teaching at 3 different universities. Alan won awards for outstanding work as a teacher as he introduced his students to field ecology through field trips and research. Alan received his undergrad degree in botany from Ohio State, his master's degree in forestry from Yale, and his PhD in forest ecology from SUNY Syracuse. Alan's teaching and research specialty is forest ecology, and one aspect of his research has been community responses by vegetation and by birds to disturbances such as fire, wind, and timber harvesting in the upper Great Lakes. Alan has written a couple of books, and he's got them up here, which you can buy after. They're just magnificent books, so hopefully you will come up after the program and buy a couple of his books. One of them is Jewels of Nature, a book on the ecology and personal experiences he has had with 92 common birds found around here. So very pertinent. The other one is Following Old Trails, a natural history of the Canadian Shield he experienced on a 7-week canoe trip along the historic fur trade routes from Lake Superior to the Hudson Bay. He's been around. Although he retired in 2007, Alan and his former students continued to do research and on bird ecology and oak savanna restoration. Okay, so here's your trivia question about Alan. Alan was portaging a canoe across the 9-mile Grand Portage, we talked about, that connects Lake Superior to the Pigeon River on the old Northwest fur trade route when he discovered he was not alone on the trail. What animal refused to yield the right of way, attacked him, and then forced him to retreat? Was it A, a mother ruffed grouse with 10 chicks? B, a mother skunk with 8 kits? Or C, a mother bear with 3 cubs? Skunk? It was the grouse. All right. Alan Haney. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, what a pleasure to be here, and I guess that you haven't discovered that baseball is going on now, right? So, at any rate, when I saw the weather and then saw that we were going into a seventh game of the World Series, I thought, well, nobody's going to be there, but I'll go up anyway after talking with Susan. So, my hats off to those of you that come out on a night like this, and hopefully you'll learn something while we're here. Well, I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about one of my favorite birds in Wisconsin. But I'd like to back up a second and say a word about the Audubon study that was done 3 years ago, looking at the way in which climate change is expected to affect birds throughout North America. Out of the 588 species of birds that nest or utilize resources in North America at various times in their lives, it was estimated based upon the best projections that were available of climate change and how that's affecting habitat and other changes that are taking place that influence these birds, that approximately 344 of these species are in serious decline. And in fact, by 2080 may not exist any longer in North America, or at least not in areas where we would be likely to see them. They might be rare hangers-on in a few odds and ends and places like that. In other words, we're anticipating that there's going to be a very, very serious change in the biodiversity as a result of changes that are taking place in the world today, but which we can see here in the United States. Now, why would we focus particularly on birds? One of the reasons is that birds have very high metabolisms. They have evolved over a very long period of time, and they have developed very intricate relationships with their habitat. And this varies from where they nest, where they feed, what they feed on, the times that they migrate, every aspect of their lives. And this is true of any species, of course, but because birds have evolved such good, close relationships with their habitats, and also because they have a very high metabolism, which means that things that happen in their environment that may influence their metabolism, such as available food or something to that sort, this is reflected very quickly in their reproductive success. And so birds are good indicators. You probably know that because you remember the canary in the mines and so forth that miners carried. The canaries detected the potential presence of noxious gases that may poison the people working there. And canaries were utilized then as an early indicator. We have the same relationship to birds that we see in the world today. They're early indicators of changes that are taking place in our environment that may have a great deal to do with our long-term survival or sustainability in the cultures that we have come to appreciate. With that as background, let's talk a little bit about my favorite bird. It's a golden-winged warbler. Golden-winged warblers once were present throughout most of Wisconsin. In fact, 70% of the population of golden-winged warblers in the world occur in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. So this is an area where they spend their summers, they do their reproduction here, and then they go south. Golden-winged warblers go to Central America and northern South America to overwinter, and then come back the following spring and continue and so forth. Well, it turns out that golden-winged warblers are decreasing in terms of their population, probably faster than any other species in North America. The population is going down at approximately 9% per year right now by estimates based on breeding bird surveys. And so there's a lot of questions about what's happening to golden-winged warblers. And why would this be such a surprise, given what I've said about what's happening to birds in general? Well, one of the reasons it's a surprise is that golden-winged warblers actually like disturbed habitat. We know, for example, that during the time of early settlement, when forests were being cut and the farms were expanding and so forth, the golden-winged warbler population increased very dramatically. And then about 100 to 120 years ago, the population began to decline, and it's been going down ever since. Well, golden-winged warblers have a closely related species, the blue-winged warbler, also a delightful bird, one that also occurs in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest. Didn't historically. Historically, it was a more southeastern species. It has been spreading north over the same period that the golden-winged warbler has been declining. It's thought that the reason that it's spreading north may be related to climate change, the warming of the climates, and related kinds of opportunities that expanded the blue-winged warbler into habitat that previously was the exclusive domain of golden-winged warblers. And so as golden-winged warblers have gone down, blue-winged warbler populations have gone up. To make matters worse, golden-winged and blue-winged warblers hybridize. And they hybridize freely. Whenever they overlap in terms of their breeding habitat, hybrids are not uncommon at all. And it's thought that blue-winged warblers have a dominant set of genes. So blue-winged warblers are more likely to have dominant genes when they do hybridize. But more importantly, what happens is that blue-winged warblers seem to be a little more exclusive than gold-winged warblers. In other words, blue-winged warblers would prefer to mate with somebody who's also a blue-winged warbler. Whereas golden-winged warblers are less exclusive, and so they will interbreed with the blue-winged warblers rather freely. And so what's happened is that we have something called genetic swamping. We have genes flowing from the blue-winged warbler population into the golden-winged warbler population. The result of that has added further stress to the adaptation of the golden-winged warbler, apparently to their niche, and they have a very, very similar preference to habitat. They both like brushy, cut-over, regrowth, early forest successional things after clear cuts, for example. In fact, most of the golden-winged warblers I've seen, and blue wings for that matter as well, have been in clear cuts after they have been cut over 3 or 4 years previously and so forth. Well, golden-winged warblers now are moving further north. They are being squeezed north by probably competitive exclusion with the blue-winged warbler, but maybe also they're adapting a little bit to climate change. And so they're moving further north, but they're getting squeezed. You don't have to go too much further north from what their original range was until you run into spruce fir. It's not a good habitat for golden-winged warblers. They like young aspen stands, and that occurs in southern Canada, to be sure. But you don't go much further north than that until you begin to find habitat that no longer is suitable for the golden-winged warbler. So the population has gone down. It's thought that the golden-winged warbler will no longer occur in Wisconsin by 2050, within the lifetime of some of you younger folks, and the blue-winged warbler will become a dominant species throughout much of the state, whereas now you can find blue wings only in the southwestern part of the state primarily. So this is an example of the complexity of how climate change affects species. We recognize that the birds will migrate pretty much on schedule. They're often determine what they do and when they do it primarily by photoperiod, among other things. And so if they come back at the same time every year based on photoperiod, they may find themselves out of phase with when the insects are emerging. Both the golden-winged and blue-winged warbler, incidentally, are caterpillar specialists. Do you ever see how the leaves of deciduous trees are often rolled up with a little green worm inside? That's their primary food. That's what they depend upon for their breeding success. And so if those insects are out of phase with when the bird is trying to feed its young, its reproductive success is going to go down. Likewise with all the other species, whether they are feeding on nectar or insects of various kinds and so forth, that is going to create further stress on them. They're more likely to get caught in a late storm or a cold snap and so forth in the spring, or possibly a more severe storm as they're crossing the Gulf from their South American overwintering habitat. So these kinds of changes are having their impact, and together they begin to account for some of the changes that we expect. Now, we've got a perfect storm affecting our birds. In addition to the climate change that's taking place, we also are seeing expanded populations, expanded development, which is beginning to fragment and to erode the habitat for the birds. So the best way for a species to survive through a very stressful period is to have very good habitat in which it can utilize cover and the food resources and so forth that are there. If that habitat is being stressed or fragmented and so forth, this really creates a perfect storm for the bird in terms of their ability to survive. And so the loss of habitat may in fact be more severe in terms of its causing the decline in birds, but coupled with climate change, then it's kind of a double whammy that creates particular problems for them. Now, we have some other indications along this that I want to just mention briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. A study just came out in the last 2 months from Germany, and German scientists working with private citizens who were out doing collections of insects, doing very standardized protocol for collecting insects. When they begin to collect these insects and weigh them up, just looking at the biomass, the total weight of the collection of insects, and these were all collected in natural areas, in nature preserve type habitats. The population, or the total biomass, I should say, of the insects has gone down about 80% in the last 27 years. So comparing the data that they're seeing now for collections made the same way in the same habitat over a 27-year period, they're seeing a decline of up to 80% in the total biomass of insects. The scientists don't know why. They think it may be related in part to pesticides, it may be related to changes in climate, it may be related to other things, but they've controlled for the habitat. So this is not a result of fragmentation or deterioration directly of the habitat, but some kind of indirect effect that's taking place, such as climate, or possibly pesticides in surrounding areas where these insects may feed and so forth. So that's another indication that things bad are happening in terms of biodiversity. Other studies have shown that the loss of biodiversity throughout the world is a serious problem, and there's study after study, indicator after indicator of some of these kinds of problems. So what do we see from birds? We're seeing that birds are simply telling us something that we ought to pay heed to. We ought to take note of the fact that these populations are going down, and that in turn is probably an indicator of loss of other species in other areas, in other habitats, probably throughout the world, particularly at the mid and high latitudes. The tropics seem to be affected to somewhat less extent, although we have severe pesticide problems there and we have loss of habitat there. So those factors are certainly going on in the tropics. But with climate change, that's more of a mid and upper latitude effect that's taking place. So why do people not pay more attention? Why are we not more alarmed by these kinds of data, by these kinds of signals that we're getting from the world in which we live? And there's all kinds of theories. I'm not a social scientist, but some of you may have questions about that. There are several theories. A study was done in 1974 by a German sociologist, for example, that asked the same question. Why did fascism take over Germany and people were silent about it? Nobody was standing up and saying, hey, this is a problem. We got to do something. People weren't talking about it. They just kept quiet. Why did that happen? We see exactly the same thing happening about climate change. People are not talking about it. People don't want to ruffle the water, or possibly they're afraid that they're going to encounter somebody who may think that the data suggests something different, or maybe it's something that we shouldn't be worried about, or maybe even that it's fake data or inconvenient truths, as Al Gore would call it. So these are questions that I think that we should be asking ourselves, and one of the first things that we should be doing is talking about it. We need to talk about these kinds of things because they're going to affect not so much us, but our children and our grandchildren and many generations to come.
Are there any birds in Wisconsin that are classified as invasive?
Definitely. You know, one of the birds that immediately comes to mind when we think about an invasive bird is the cowbird. The brown-headed cowbird. This is a bird that has always been here. It's a native bird to Wisconsin, but its population has greatly expanded with the expansion of agriculture, and it in fact may have peaked out in the early last century when small farms and livestock were more prominent. But what we've done also is that we have taken a lot of the large forested tracts and we've broke them up with housing developments and roads and shopping centers and ownership patterns and so forth that result in them being opened with a lot more edge. And it turns out that cowbirds are very invasive in the edges of the forest. They don't go into the interior very much. So forest interior birds, like the wood thrush, for example, are very vulnerable to cowbird nest predation. The cowbirds lay their eggs in the nest of other birds. And they are very precocious chicks when they hatch. They will take most of the food that the parents are bringing, and so the survival rate of the birds who is being parasitized drops proportionately. And some birds, some warblers, for example, are extremely vulnerable to cowbirds. So that would be an example of an invasive species, and there are others. The house finch is another example of an invasive. In fact, the increase in the house finch, which has occurred only in the last 50 years or so, this was a native species to the Southwest. It was introduced to Long Island as a cage canary, as a singing bird. It spread out from there and invaded Wisconsin around 1988. I don't remember seeing a house finch when I first came to Wisconsin in 1988. You now see them all over the state and in feeders everywhere you look. This bird is overlapping the niche of our native purple finch. Purple finch populations are going down, house finch populations continue to go up. So many examples.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, I live out in the boonies, and I used to have a lot of whippoorwills out there. I hear them all the time. I haven't heard one for 4 or 5 years. Are they in trouble?
They are. The whippoorwill is a good example of another one of many species whose populations are crashing. The whippoorwill is a member of the goatsucker family. It's a big family of birds. They're very, very common in the tropics. It was one of the few members of that family that we had natively. I grew up with them in southern Ohio, and I can remember at night going out, and there were, it seemed like dozens, but certainly whippoorwills all around, all through the night in the spring of the year when they were going through their breeding period. And so it was such a prevalent presence at night when things are quiet to hear those whippoorwills. Whippoorwills are insectivorous birds. They feed exclusively on insects. And so going back to that study in Germany where we saw an 80% decline in the biomass of insects may be related to the decline that we're seeing in species like whippoorwill, but pesticides also are undoubtedly a problem. So the residual presence of pesticides in many of the insects that the whippoorwill would eat may be also a problem. They also probably are suffering a little bit from habitat loss. They like fairly open pasture, open prairie, grassland kind of habitat, and much of that has now been developed or it's overgrown with trees and so forth that are coming in that are less attractive for the whippoorwill. So there may be some habitat issues there as well.
A question over here?
Can you comment on the status of the Kirtland's warbler? I understand that there have been some populations emerging, I think, in south-central Wisconsin.
Yes, I don't know a lot of details. I haven't seen the population data recently, but as you probably know, the Kirtland's warbler was an endangered species. It has been protected, and there's been a significant investment in managing the habitat for a Kirtland warbler. Kirtland's like a very, very particular habitat, young jack pine. And so young jack pine that came in abundantly after the frequent fires that dotted this whole region in the upper Great Lakes historically have been largely suppressed, but what we have instead is that we have red pine plantations or hardwood, aspen, and so forth. Kirtlands don't like aspen, and they're not very fond of red pine. They like young jack pines, and they like it only in a certain age group of about 7 to 12 years of age or something of that sort. And so if that habitat is there, the Kirtland does pretty well. Otherwise, it's not doing well at all. So that was one where habitat loss was the primary problem that it's had. It also has cowbird predation problems. Where jack pine has been managed for maintaining that age class that the Kirtland's warbler requires, they've done quite well.
Running.
Well, after several large fires in Michigan, that jack pine regeneration, there was a population boost, and historically, I think the Kirtland warblers were maybe non-existent in the state, and so that a population existed seemed like a kind of an accident, or that there would be more dispersal here? And maybe that's where I was going with my inquiry.
Yeah. Well, the other thing about Kirtland's warblers is that this is a bird that overwinters in the Bahamas. And so what's happened in their winter habitat has been a serious problem for the Kirtlands as well. And that coupled to just habitat prevalence in the area where they breed.
Question here?
One of the factors of climate change is increased severity of storms. So I wonder if you would comment about impacts on birds relative to these increasingly severe storms.
Yeah, thanks for the question, John. Timing of the storm is everything when it comes to the birds. If the storm if the storm hits the bird prior to migration, or hits the area that they're going to be migrating through, it may have very little effect on them, because whether the trees are blown down or not doesn't make too much difference for a migrating bird that's just passing through. If, however, the severity of the storm hits during the time that they're nesting, it's a serious problem because of the severe wind and turbulence associated with many of these storms. Hail damage might be related to that. They can lose their nest and lose that opportunity for that year's reproduction quite easily. Some birds will nest again. In fact, some of our birds will try not once, twice, sometimes as many as 5 times. Incidentally, that's one of the characteristics of the house finch. It will do as many as 5 generations in a single summer. So very persistent, very high fecundity for the house finch. Many of our migratory warblers, however, whose populations are almost entirely declining, if they lose their nest, that's it for the season. They're done. And they head back south. And so they've lost a whole year. And you say, well, that's no big deal, it's just a year. Keep in mind that these birds live at most for maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe if they are lucky, they might live 7 years. So losing a whole year of reproduction makes a big difference to a lot of these birds that are migratory. So timing is everything. If the storm occurs in the spring, when the birds are just arriving, it can make a huge difference, because it's not so much the wind or even the snow perhaps, but it may be the cold that's associated with the front as it comes through that causes the problem to just do away with their insect prey for a period of time. And of course, the bird metabolism is such that if they go a whole day without eating, they're in serious trouble. In 2 days, particularly if it's cold, they're done. So they don't have the luxury of having a lot of stored fat, particularly as they're just arriving from migration. So they live very, very close to the edge. And so these storms in the spring, these early or even late spring storms, can do serious damage to the survival of many of these species.
Question back here?
Amber Roth and Don Waller, 2 people you probably know.
I do.
I attended the Discovery Center Bird Festival this summer, and Amber Roth's graduate student, who works in this area, said, we need this young forest initiative. We need early successional aspen for my bird, the golden warbler. But then my good friend Don Waller says, oh no, we need big, long, huge tracts of old growth, because there are a bunch of unique birds that need that habitat. Who's right? Where do we stand on this?
They're both right. It's absolutely true. We know what the golden wing warbler requires. If all the forests were cut down and converted over to young second growth, golden wing warblers probably would do quite well. But we would lose a lot of these mature forest species in the process. So it's the balance that we need. You know, historically, if we look at what the world was like out there before people arrived, we had all that diversity of habitat. We had young forest after fire. We had young forest after wind came through and blew down some of the old forest. And we had a lot of old forest as well. So that diversity of habitat was there. And probably the diversity of the habitat is a key to having a diverse biodiversity of species that live in those habitats. And so the balance is what we really need to strive to achieve.
Question here?
We've all seen the tremendous crash in evening grosbeaks. Is there any indication of exactly what's causing that?
Well, evening grosbeaks, a real puzzle in many respects. If you look historically, back 100, 150 years ago, evening grosbeaks were a western species. They moved east about 150 years ago, or even went as far east as in New England, where at one time they reached fairly good population numbers. And certainly here in our area, we had large numbers of evening grosbeak even as recently as 20 years ago. There's been a lot of speculation about why they moved east and how that came about. Turns out that evening grosbeak eat the seeds of box elder. That's one of their favorite foods. And as the settlers went west, they spread box elder across the plains. And that provided an opportunity for evening grosbeaks to move from box elder to box elder, coming back east and eventually reaching this area. I suspect the explanation is far more complex than that, but it's an example of one of these subtleties that comes about as a result of the way that we interact with our environments. But the evening grosbeak is a finch, and finches are notorious in terms of population swings. Look at our crossbills, for example. You see very few crossbills now. Used to, we saw a lot of red crossbill and some white-winged crossbills. That population has gone down, and that's not uncommon for that to happen over a period of, 20 or 30-year cycles. So the fact that the evening grosbeak has become so uncommon over the past 20 or 30 years opens the question, is that just part of a big cycle that we don't understand what's controlling, or has the population really decreased? And if we look at the population across North America, we can kind of conclude that population has gone down quite a little bit. But for whatever reason, it also has moved back north and west. And so we don't see many evening grosbeaks in Wisconsin any longer. And with climate change, we're anticipated that we won't see them at all. What evening grosbeaks there will be back up in Canada and further west in the boreal forest.
We have a question online.
This is another question from Olson Memorial Library. Will it help if neighborhoods work on making habitat, or won't they adapt to this, like, for example, golden-winged warblers?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that have happened in terms of our backyards and neighborhoods that have affected birds. Certainly the feeders that we see so prevalent now, if people keep them supplied with sunflower seeds and Niger and other seeds that the birds like, that will greatly help overwintering birds, chickadee populations and cardinals and so forth, blue jays, mourning doves, yellow finches. All these birds will really be helped by that. As far as the migratory passerines, the thing that we could do is perhaps preserve some nesting habitat that they require. And many of the birds, such as, indigo buntings, for example, would be an example that comes to mind. Golden-winged warbler would be another one. If we have an opportunity to create an old field kind of environment, or maybe a vacant lot kind of environment where we allow bushes to kind of come in to intermix with some of the herbaceous species and grasses that are there, that would favor some of those birds. But many of the birds that come are very particular about needing relatively undisturbed habitat, spruce fir forest, or large tracts of forest, for example, as is the case with the ovenbird and so forth. So these birds probably need the kind of habitats that we are least able to do in terms of our backyards and neighborhoods. So some birds, yes. Many birds, we probably can't do too much in our backyards and neighborhoods, at least.
Question here.
That was a great segue to my question.
Good.
Because this is really more of a plug for things that we can do as individuals, really, to benefit birds. There are a lot of man-made, our man-made environment is not always healthy for birds. Between glass strikes, other types of strikes, light pollution, which is also another problem for, you were talking about the whippoorwills earlier. The more we have lighted areas that were once dark, all of those moths are being killed by lights. So birds like that are dependent upon flying insects, a lot of their food sources being killed and destroyed. But also we have people who move into the Northwoods and bring their pets, especially cats, those types of things. We just have to remember that we as individuals, we have the ability to really kind of help protect birds from our man-made kind of problems. And this is also just a plug, you were talking about feeder birds. I know there's an issue here in the Northwoods of a lot of feeder birds being contaminated with salmonellosis, basically. And so just as a reminder for people to keep their feeders clean, once they see birds that are sick, make sure that they bring birds in to rehabilitation centers, but also to remove those feeders immediately so they're not attracting healthy birds to a kind of a contaminated area. Those are just comments, basically, as a reminder. I just think we always need those reminders sometimes. But I have a kind of a question that kind of, puzzles me too, is what role do you think the extinction of the passenger pigeon had in the health of our forests, and maybe the role of deer now also in keeping these new young growth forests from developing? So I don't know if you have any comments on how can the passenger pigeon, which is such a huge number of birds, there had to have been an effect on our forests once that species went extinct. And then also our deer populations are really kind of keeping our forests from being healthy.
Well, you've asked a question that's worthy of several doctoral dissertations. It would be hard to answer, to speculate. It would not be an answer. It'd be a quick speculation. There is no question that the passenger pigeon had huge effect on our forest. Among other things, they ate prodigious quantities of acorns and other hard bast. And that obviously affected the reproductive success of some species, maybe even encouraged the reproductive success of others. I have studied oak savannas as one of the areas that I've looked at over the years, and oak savannas were a particularly important habitat for the nesting passenger pigeons. And I've always suspected that the passenger pigeon was a major predator of the oaks, maybe discouraged the oak forest from succeeding to a closed forest as fast as it otherwise would if fire is suppressed. Chad's a good savanna specialist too. We could get his opinion on this, but it may be that that was one of the roles they had, but they probably had lots of other effects as well. Can you imagine the amount of nitrogen that the passenger pigeon concentrated in those areas where they were nesting, for example, and how important they were to their predators? You can imagine that the Cooper's hawks must have had a heyday during the times of the passenger pigeon abundance. So we don't know all those effects. We can only speculate. People weren't paying very close attention at the time that the passenger pigeon went extinct and when those populations crashed. But the important lesson there is that a species that may be doing extraordinarily well can go downhill very, very fast with stress placed on it through whatever reason, whether it's hunting or whether it's climate change or loss of habitat.
As I'm sure you know, cats, not just feral cats, but people letting cats out have a tremendous effect on the birds in the millions. What can we do about that?
Well, there's two answers. One is keep your cat inside. The other is get your target practice on cats if you see them outside. Cats are probably one of the biggest predators of nesting passerines that we have. Somebody was asking about what we can do at the community level. Probably at that community backyard level, cats are a major stress on the reproductive success of our passerines. And so, no question, Stan Temple, who I think has spoken up here, Stan Temple can tell you a lot more about how important the cats are. I believe, I'm taking this from memory, but I believe his estimate was that 5 million songbirds a year are killed by feral cats in Wisconsin. So we're looking at a major problem. And we're all guilty of it. I mean, we all contribute to this, but there was a time not in the too distant past when there weren't feral cats in Wisconsin. That's one of the things that we did. We introduced feral cats into a habitat, into a region, into a bioregion where they didn't previously occur, and it changed all kinds of things as a result of that. So, no, a very important point that you make, and certainly I agree with you.
Question here?
I was wondering if you'd comment on the fact that the Northwoods is the southernmost range for a lot of northern birds. Awful lot of birds just get down here and otherwise are Canadian birds.
Right.
So with climate change, we're going to be pushing a lot of those birds north. I just wondered if you would give examples of some different species we are very likely to lose in the near future.
Well, in addition to the golden-winged warbler, which we know, the evening grosbeak, it's actually a long list. In Wisconsin, we have an estimated 244 species that nest in Wisconsin, 244 species. Of those, it's estimated that 50 of them are going to be in jeopardy as a result of climate change and associated changes in habitat and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to go extinct, but as you suggest, that means their populations are going to be shifting north and out of our area. And so I can't begin off the top of my head to cite those species, but if you think of, you can almost, a mallard duck for the, you think, oh, way, mallard ducks? Mallard ducks may no longer nest in Wisconsin by 2080, according to the models that people have developed. And these are very sophisticated models with some of our best climate scientists involved. And so there are a lot of species that probably will move north and can continue to exist, but which you won't be able to see in this area. And you're absolutely right. This area is particularly nice because just to the south, we're right on the edge, just to the south you have a lot of the southern species that are reaching their northern limit, and just to the north you have a lot of these northern species that are reaching their southern limit. So we have a particularly good opportunity to see a lot of these species right in the Minocqua area, and those, as climate changes, those are likely to move further north so that we won't see them, or at least we'll have to travel some distance to find them.
Yeah, in an effort, I guess, to combat climate change to some degree, we're seeing utilities go more and more to large-scale wind turbines, and I'm wondering how that affects birds, and for that matter, we're also seeing a lot of cell towers, and I wonder if that affects birds as well.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught all the question. Could you repeat it?
We're seeing a lot more wind turbines as utilities go to alternative energies.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that affects birds, and also we're also seeing a lot more cell towers, and I wonder if that affects them as well.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you could all hear that okay, but the question is, what is the effect of wind towers and so forth on bird populations? There's no question wind towers do take their toll. At the same time, in saying that, probably the place where we can make the biggest gain in getting off fossil fuels, particularly coal, is in wind generation of electricity. So we have great opportunity there, both onshore and offshore opportunities that we could take advantage of. What's been interesting is that since wind turbines first were developed, the technology has continued to be improved. And now these wind turbines are made bigger and bigger with longer blades and so forth that turn very slow. I don't know if you've seen them, but they turn so slow you think they're not working. They're turning slow enough that birds and bats can now sense and avoid those collisions with the blades with a very high degree of success. That's not to say there isn't some, but there is far less than there was when wind turbines first came out. Cell towers, different matter. You know, a lot of the migratory birds, particularly these passerines that are coming long distances, fly at night. Most of them fly at night. They think the reason for that is that you have a very high temperature buildup during the exertion of flying such long distances, and it's cooler at night, and they have less heat stress, and therefore take advantage of that, and probably less predation as well. But there's two things that are a real problem for doing that. One is running into obstructions such as cell towers. And it's very hard for the bird that may be flying 30 or 40 miles an hour to sense that tower and avoid it in a split second. And so there are serious losses associated with cell towers. The only thing that might exceed that are some of our skyscraper buildings along some of the major migratory routes that keep lights lit at night, and the birds will fly into those windows. I have seen pictures, and perhaps you have as well, of people walking around the streets of Chicago, for example, picking up dead birds off of the sidewalk by the bushel from just a single night of collisions that take place in those buildings. We need to educate people to keep the lights off of those buildings and out of the windows. and to do everything they can to make it less likely that birds are going to fly into buildings. There will always be some, but perhaps we can do something to reduce that.
Question back here.
I think most of us know that climate change is a subject the Department of Natural Resources can't deal with anymore. I'm wondering if the political climate has influenced the university, or is it still somewhat buffered by academic freedom, and are you folks able to do your climate research and education as you will?
I'm trying to think how I can answer that question tactfully. It has affected the university, to be sure. Universities are dependent upon public money in addition to private money. And public money now is controlled by different political forces as time goes. I mean, it ebbs and flows and so forth. But we happen to be in a time when public money is being challenged for doing research. It's affected the DNR with the loss of their scientists. It's affected the Forest Service. It's affected the universities and to some extent. I would have to say, however, having spent the better part of my life in universities, that academic freedom is still there. It varies a little bit depending upon administrations and so forth, but for the most part, I think scientists are still pretty free to pursue their research, and particularly if they're successful in raising private research money, or public research money for that matter, although that too has gotten harder to get, then I think scientists have pretty much a free hand to conduct their research. Public output, speaking to the press, more likely to see some pushback there from the administration if you get too outspoken about some of these issues that run counter to what the political opinion is among the powers that be.
Do you have any observations about our favorite common loon and eagles that are mostly seem like dependent on the lakes rather than the woods?
Yes. Loons won't be in Wisconsin probably by 2050, certainly by 2080. Loons will not be nesting in Wisconsin. That's one of the species, going back to your question, John, that clearly climate change is pushing that bird further north. We also see habitat effects from loons with the development around many of the lakes that historically were less developed, and now some of those areas that were loons previously nested are no longer accessible or attractive to them because of development, houses, and so forth. Bald eagles, more mobile. Bald eagles are very sensitive to people, and so they will fly long distances, but they are capable of seeking out refuge or isolated places for nesting pretty well. So the bald eagle population is probably going to suffer less than loon populations, at least here in Wisconsin, although we may see fewer bald eagles over time simply because of development occurring. That's true of other species like great blue herons, for example, as well, which need, they nest in rookeries and they need fairly large isolated tracts in wetlands or near wetlands in order to nest. And so those are getting more and more impacted by development and people pushing into these habitats that previously were less affected.
Question back here.
So I have a question to take on from the gentleman's question about the feral cats. Some folks seem to advocate for trap, neuter, release, which others don't agree with. But what are your thoughts on that as a management for cats and how effective that would be on helping birds?
Trapping and releasing feral cats?
Trap, neuter, or release.
Yeah. Were you going to release them would be my first question. It may be a serious problem. If you pay any attention to these humane societies, every county has their humane society, and they have the dogs and cats and so forth that they've rounded up. They have a superabundance of cats. You want a cat? Go to any humane society and take your pick. There are hundreds to choose from. So cats, again, are very capable of living without people. And they are excellent candidates for feral behavior. Finding their way around, finding food where you think it doesn't exist. Whether it's mice or shrews or birds or what have you, they are very, very successful. So if trapping them is certainly a problem. So I suggest this: if you trap them, take them to the vet, pay the bill, and have them neutered. And that's probably the best thing that we can do other than disposing of them or adopting them and bringing them inside.
Question way in the back here.
So at the end of your talk, you talked a little bit about the importance of climate change communication and getting more people to understand and be aware and care about climate change. And I'm wondering, from your perspective with your discipline, how would we go about doing that?
This is a perfect example. This is a perfect example. So we need opportunities at every opportunity for people that have studied the phenomena, who have a good basis for discussing it, to get it out. And it doesn't have to be factual or a lecture of fact. It can be simply, hey, here's what I think, what do you think? Just sharing concerns and so forth. We know, for example, that about 45% of Americans are either concerned or really scared of climate change. Almost half the people in the United States see this as a serious problem that we're not dealing with. How could half the people in the United States think this is a problem? And how often do you read about it in the paper? How often do you hear about it on radio? Not very much at all, because it's not sexy or people will think it's too controversial or whatever. How many people believe it's a hoax or that it's something that we don't need to worry about? At most, maybe 21%, 1 out of 5. So it's not that the people who are concerned about climate change aren't really concerned. And it's certainly not that science don't tell us that we should be concerned. 95, 96% of the scientists who study climates in the world are in agreement that climate change is real. It's something that we are doing because of the dependence on fossil fuel and so forth. So we know the cause, we know we're responsible, but we're reluctant to talk about it. And it becomes a self-perpetuating silence if we don't talk about it. So I would say talk about it. Talk about it with your neighbors, your family, your children. Goodness sakes, it's the children that are going to pay the big price. We need to be helping them understand what's happening and how we can go about moving off of the fossil fuel dependency that we've created in our technology.
Yeah, so at the university level and at the state agency level, most of the funding for wildlife research comes from federal dollars, Pittman-Robertson dollars. Our local state senator here has declared that no Pittman-Robertson dollars will be spent on any projects that are associated with climate change. His name is Tom Tiffany, by the way. So if you're all wondering how one can be engaged locally, one can think about the kind of people we're putting in office.
I couldn't agree with you more. And furthermore, I would say you've got a choice. It's called voting. It's a right that we have here in the United States, and part of the problem is because people were apathetic about going to the polls. We cannot afford to be apathetic about going to the polls and taking a position on things like that.
Yeah, I have a question and a comment, though, too. For those of you who are not aware, with the Wisconsin Conservation Council has their annual meetings as well, where many different environmental issues are brought up, from high-capacity wells to also the use of funds in developing new wildlife regulations. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that meeting, which is in April of every year, is mainly for hunters and fishermen. But it's not. It's for all of us who are concerned about the environment and who are concerned about conservation in Wisconsin. I see some of the members of the Wisconsin Conservation Council board here, which is great to see. And that's where I think we also forget that we have a voice in Wisconsin. We have a very powerful voice in Wisconsin. I highly, highly encourage everyone to attend that meeting every April. You can make proposals and resolutions. I have a resolution that's going forward through the council right now on trying to minimize and mitigate for lead contamination through our lead fishing gear and lead hunting gear, which is still allowed. It's not allowed for waterfowl hunting, but other hunting. So that's one way for us to really be active and have a voice in how our legislators, know what we really think is important in Wisconsin. But the other thing, too, is I just wanted to also ask about, because I'm not a native of Wisconsin, but when I first moved here, I was just amazed at the amount of biomass that comes off of lakes in the spring with the emergence of the midges and other aquatic insects. But that seems like it's just a huge resource to everything from fish to, passerines, to even Bonaparte gulls and things like that. But there seems to be this inconsistency of when the ice goes out. So I don't know if there is research that's been done on those massive emergence, of those kinds of insects and their role in migratory, especially passerines and stuff like that. Devil's Lake is to me it was I don't know, it was one of the most spectacular wildlife experiences I've ever had. And I'm a wildlife biologist. It's been in many places. But to see the midge emergence in Devil's Lake was one of the greatest wildlife spectacles I ever saw. So I just thought, I don't know if there's any research that's being done on the ice out of lakes and the importance of those aquatic insects when they emerge.
Well, thanks for your comments about the Conservation Congress, and also Susan is the one that ought to answer your question about the emergence of midges and other insects from the water in the spring of the year. Very important to a lot of our birds, very important, as you know. And so many of our swallows, for example, depend upon that emergence in the spring of the year when those out. And so their timing is very important to the emergence of those and other insects. But you're absolutely right about that particular source.
Question online?
Yeah, another question online. People are wondering about turkeys. We see a lot of turkeys up here we never used to. Is that natural? Are we returning to what used to be here, or is this new? And I'm curious, why do they eat so much gravel?
Yeah. Well, turkeys have crops, and the gravel helps them to grind the coarse feed that they otherwise would use, whether it's grain or buds from plants or various vegetative things that they consume. So they eat a wide variety of vegetable material, along with insects and a lot of other things as well. But the gravel is part of that process for chickens and turkeys and so forth. Turkeys were introduced back to Wisconsin. They were here originally. They disappeared. They became extirpated from Wisconsin. We traded, if I remember right, rough grouse with Missouri in exchange for turkeys coming back to Wisconsin. And it was a tremendous success. I don't have to tell you. All you have to do is get on the road and drive, and you can see how successful that reintroduction was. So we do have good conservation success stories to look at occasionally. The turkey population has continued to expand since they were introduced, I think in 1974. Do you remember what year they were introduced? I'm guessing it was 1974, thereabouts. So they haven't been here all that long, but they have continued to expand. They're doing quite well. Hunting doesn't seem to have much effect on turkeys. They seem to deal with predation quite well. Coyotes, bobcats, and so forth take their toll, but turkeys seem to handle that quite well. And the population is definitely expanding. They are now moving into habitat that is not as attractive for turkeys. So the primary habitat for turkeys are agriculturally related fields, particularly where manure is spread in the wintertime, which turkeys rely on to a considerable extent to forage the grain out of the manure from the dairy operations and livestock operations in general. But they, of course, lived and survived before there were farms, before people were here, but probably the numbers were far lower than we see today. So they probably aren't going to be able to expand much more, and as a matter of fact, some people now project that the turkey population may begin to shrink a little bit for one reason or the other. So we may be seeing the peak of turkeys in Wisconsin at this particular time.
I saw something a couple of years ago about cardinals in the state of Wisconsin, and a map of the state showed they were prevalent everywhere except Vilas County. Is that because of the white and red pine or a lack of spruce?
Yeah.
And secondly, when we were on climate change, I would like everybody, if they could, that's interested in this, go on your computer, look up CCL, Citizen Climate Lobby, with David Barnhill. Do it, join it, you'll never regret it.
Yeah, it's certainly one way to get active. It's a very active group and so forth. Cardinals. Cardinals were not known from this part of Wisconsin if you go back 100 years. Cardinals were a southern species that, and we don't know historically, maybe at one time they were common throughout the region. But this is a species that's been moving north very steadily, and we see them pretty much throughout the state now. So Maymont and Vilas County yet, my guess is they're there. They haven't been recorded, but they will be. They're on their way.
They're here.
Yeah.
They're here. Any other questions? Oh, here's one.
About 4 years ago, I had a red-headed woodpecker for a summer, but
Lucky
I haven't
you.
seen. What's their population like?
Yeah, the red-headed woodpecker is an oak savanna specialist, and so when oak savannas were prevalent throughout the Midwest, red-headed woodpeckers were probably at their peak. As those savannas were cut or built up with homes or overgrown to become forest, the red-headed woodpecker population went down. My opinion, it's one of the most beautiful birds that we have in the Midwest. But they hang around. I have a pair nesting in my orchard where I have scattered apple trees, and the red-headed woodpeckers are there most summers, not every summer. They didn't come this summer. But they seem to be hanging around. They also take advantage of sunflower feeders, and so if you have a good sunflower feeder and you keep it clean, red-headed woodpeckers will work it real hard through the summer. But they are a migratory woodpecker. They do move south in the winter as far as they need to in order to find suitable forage opportunities. And so we wouldn't have them typically through our winter, only in the summer breeding period. Incidentally, the red-bellied woodpecker is one of these populations that's increasing too, so they are becoming more and more common.
I have a question. What are your thoughts on feeding birds? Do they really need our help? And what are implications? Are there any negative implications like there are with feeding deer, which many people are not a fan of?
Yeah, again, one of these questions that's well worthy of a doctoral dissertation. A lot of people speculated all about that. Let's take the hummingbird, for example, a ruby-throated hummingbird. I have debated with myself and sometimes even waking at night and thinking about, should I put out a hummingbird feeder or not? And I don't have a good answer. I know when I do, they utilize it. I suspect it makes it a little easier for them when it comes to getting calories or a little nourishment that's provided in good hummingbird food now that you can get at the store during the lean periods when there may not be insects or nectar available. So maybe something that we should do. I keep backyard feeders, and I keep them through the summer. I put out soot for the woodpeckers and nuthatches and chickadees and so forth that utilize it. And there's no question that these birds are drawn to those resources in the wintertime. We build up some fairly significant populations around our feeders if we keep them filled. One thing I would caution, if you have a feeder, do not put seed in it and then let it go during the bad weather periods when it's not very convenient to get out there and fill it. If you're going to have a feeder, be religious about keeping it there, because otherwise you're baiting the birds in and they become a little dependent upon the feeder, and then when they need it most, it's not there, and that creates some serious problems for them. So I would say the key to feeding is cleanliness. Keep your feeders clean. Keep them filled, particularly through the inclement periods of time. You don't have to fill feeders in the summertime if you don't want to, because the birds probably don't need it much then anyway. The hummingbird might be an exception. But particularly in the wintertime, I don't know that there's been proven any serious harm other than the diseases associated with unsanitary feeders. I should qualify that one more way. If your feeder is near your home, you may be setting the birds up for window collisions a little bit more. So that may be one of the downer effects of feeders as well.
Better than bird feeders are the plants that hummingbirds will come to.
Absolutely.
They have a better quality nutrition. Do you have some recommendations for gardeners and non-gardeners alike about plant populations that we can support to give these birds a hand?
Well, I have a bias, and this is outside my area of expertise. I was trained early on as a botanist, but I can't make that claim now. I think my bias is for native species as opposed to exotics. Not that there aren't a lot of exotic species in our flower catalogs that we can't plant and that do quite well in our area and so forth. And some of these, the hummingbirds seem to really take advantage of and utilize. But wherever we have the opportunity, I would say create a rain garden or create a little prairie patch or create a little natural habitat in which both insects and the birds can find resources there. Make a little ecosystem, if you will, in your backyard when you can do that. And I think that's a better way to go. But there are lots of species that birds will like. Of course, the hummingbirds prefer or seem to be attracted to red and tubular flowers. And so anything that's red and tubular, chances are you're going to attract some hummingbirds to it.
Any other questions?
Another question, can birds have a positive impact on tree insect pests like the emerald ash borer or the eastern tent caterpillar?
Absolutely. That has been clearly proven. Work was done at the Missouri Botanical Garden years ago. They put netting over some trees that prevented the birds, but which had coarse enough that insects could fly in and out, and compared it to insect populations in trees that didn't have netting. And the trees that had the bird netting to exclude the birds, the insect population shot way up. And we're talking about tremendous numbers of insects in a tree. You don't even begin to appreciate it. You know, we're talking about dozens and dozens of species of everything you can imagine that may be feeding in that tree in rather obscure ways that we don't see. Remember that the insects' protection against predation is camouflage. And our eyes are not particularly trained to see the insect, whereas the birds have very keen eyes, so that camouflage has to be pretty darn good. So we often aren't even aware of how much insects there may be on the tree. But there's no question that the birds have a tremendously positive effect on insect populations. It's been shown many, many times, and the data are just absolutely conclusive in that regard.
A question about bird feeders. So I feed 11 months of the year, and I disappear in February.
For shame.
Yeah. Would you leave your dog in your house for the month of February?
Should you not feed if you're going to do that?
Well, it's a good question you ask, and I would suggest if you have a neighbor or a relative that could keep your feeder going, that would be the ideal solution to that. Otherwise, you might wean them off. So I would, if I were going to do that, I think I would reduce the amount of food I put out there over a period of a few weeks so they can begin to look for other sources. You don't just leave them cold turkey on a cold February morning.
Another question came in online. Are there any invasive bird species that you're worried about that might come in the future that are kind of on our doorstep?
Well, nothing comes to mind. I heard somebody mention starling and so forth. These species have been here for a long time. Starlings were introduced back at the beginning of the last century, back in that period of time. And so the population has spread, and it's certainly here, but their population, they compete with particularly cavity nesting birds, so their impact is primarily in terms of competing for cavities. But house sparrows the same way that, you know, we don't see the house sparrow populations continuing to explode. So I don't think of any species that is invasive, unlike plant species like garlic mustard and buckthorn and some of these things that clearly are invasive and having a serious problem. I can't think of an example of a bird that's doing that same thing. Hey, can anybody suggest one? European Yeah, the house sparrow maybe. You know, it's interesting. I was in England 2 years ago, and I was walking down a street in actually it was in Ireland. It was in Dublin, and I walked past an old church, and I happened to look down the alley past the church, and I saw a vacant lot that was naturalized, and I saw a sign. I thought, well, that's interesting. So I walked back this alley, and there was this. It couldn't have been. It wasn't as big as this room, with all kinds of weeds and grass and brush and so forth in it. And this sign said, do not disturb, habitat for protecting house sparrows. The house sparrow is rare there, and they like them. And so they were really trying to take advantage of a little open green space in order to encourage house sparrows. So the house sparrow clearly has done better here without the predation or disease or whatever keeps it intact. But I don't know that they're becoming a real serious problem anywhere I've seen.
Can I just have a follow-up on the invasive species?
Sure.
The Monk Parakeet, which is moving further and further north from Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, that area, that is expected to be into the upper Midwest sometime by 2080 if climate change proceeds on the course that it's going on. However, that's a species that could potentially be taking the niche that was once occupied by the Carolina parakeet. I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts on that, basically. I mean, it is a non-native species that was introduced in the southeast of the United States. It's moving steadily further north.
Yeah. I mean, you probably know more about it than I do, so I can't really comment on it. But Carolina parakeet, of course, is one of the species that was once here and occupied a place in our fauna that is no longer with us. And so there might be a vacant niche there to be filled.
Okay. That's it?
I wanted to, could I say just a quick word,
Absolutely.
Susan?
Sure, please.
This is the advertisement. This book, which is Following Old Trails, it's available for $15 if anybody would like a copy. Primarily focusing on natural history as well as cultural history and how those two things are woven together along those old fur trade routes. And then Jewels of Nature's 3 years since it was published. All the proceeds go to the Audubon Club. And for $10, it's yours. It sold for $22 originally, but because we're at the end of the supply, we're trying to get rid of the last $10.
Thank you so much.